And a very good morning to all of you out in the internet lands. We are here with our post-service discussion. We just finished up with Reverend Dennis Reynolds' service titled "What We Worship?" question mark. And Dennis, it's always a great pleasure to have you for discussion time.
Good to be here.
Yeah. So to me, like what this week's service did for me more than anything is it touched to the very heart of what's happening. I would say primarily with our religion, our church, that of Unitarian Universalism, um, and and the encroachment of politics into religion. And one of the things that you talked about was the resignation of ministers or church leadership. And I was hoping that maybe you could give us a little bit more background on that, since it seemed to be like that was an inspiring point of what you were talking about.
Right. Well, I mean, part of what I came to over the last few weeks is the sense that dissension within the ranks in Unitarian Universalism isn't new. Because we're questioning faith, we question who we've been and who we are. Um, so just to fill in a little bit of the pieces, and people who haven't followed it in UU world and, the various places where it's been discussed. In 2017, actually, let me do a preface back. General Assembly 2016 in Columbus, Ohio. Every year, General Assembly, which is our business meeting and whole lots of workshops and lots of other stuff, there was a proposal for congregational study topics. And one of them was about preserving our democracy. One was looking at climate change and environmental issue. And one was looking at white privilege and the reality of racial issues in Unitarian Universalism. And the climate justice folks stepped down and said, we think we absolutely as a faith need to look at issues of race and white supremacy. And it was narrowly defeated.
Hmm.
To the shock as many, we're going to have what I call sort of this heady intellectual UU discussion about Citizens United and very sort of, heady stuff. And once again, from my sense, the gathered delegates that says, we don't want to talk about stuff that might be uncomfortable, because discussions about race and privilege and history and all those issues, I will acknowledge, have made me very uncomfortable. So the communities of color drum diverse racial UU ministries, which are DREs and music directors and ministers of color, have a group that meets together. And they were sort of seething, as whereas Allies for Racial Equality, which is another UU group that I'm a member of, that's whites who are trying to figure out how to be supportive allies. We're really frustrated. And then the following winter, there was a job search for a director of the southern region of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And they hired a white man who was then living in the Southwest and said, well, you don't even need to move to this district and you can be here. Well, shortly thereafter, Peter Morales was at a gathering of Drum, I believe it was. And he said, he was asked, were there any qualified candidates of color? And he said, no, there weren't. And a woman of color spoke up and said, actually, I was a finalist, but I wasn't really considered. And she described that the reason they said she wasn't considered for the position is it wouldn't be a good fit. Now, that particular language is a trigger for some, many women who were the first generation of women moving into leadership roles were often told, you won't be a good fit with the good old boys network. And so that particular reason for dismissing a candidate didn't go down well with some. And a whole bunch of hubbub ensued, most of which we all kind of knew was out there, but we didn't really know what was being said. In the midst of this, Peter Morales, who's interestingly enough a person of color as a Latino man, said, I'm not the person to lead you through this difficult time, and he resigned. And to the shock of many, I mean, I've known Peter for years. Peter was a member of the Eugene Church and owned a small newspaper in Cottage Grove that he sold to go to seminary.
Whoa.
The whole idea that one could in midlife, or, you know, he was in his 40s, I was in my 50s, go to seminary and become a UU minister. The place I first got the idea was from Peter, because he left the Eugene congregation to pursue this, you know, audacious dream of being a UU minister. Did amazing work in Colorado, and then ran for and was elected president.
So real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So Peter resigned because he didn't feel as though the leadership was addressing the issue of racial justice.
Well, Peter said, I'm not the person to lead you in these times. And I've heard various versions.
Okay.
That one version is Peter had some, and this is only rumored, Peter had some cardiac or other health issues that he kind of went, this is too stressful. Okay. I'm not doing it, for his own well-being. But the whole reasons are not clear.
Okay.
Peter did some amazing work. I was so proud when Peter participated in civil disobedience in Arizona around immigration laws and targeting of Latino people. Peter harbored a refugee in his own home for extended period of times and was really out there seeming to publicly do the work. And so it came as a big surprise to lots of people.
Okay. So that was quite different than some of the images I had in my mind from your service. But I still have another question about, you mentioned those who were uncomfortable tackling the issues surrounding, now of course I wholly disagree with the term white supremacy and white privilege, but those issues, and for the people who would have a problem addressing those issues, do you feel like you can articulate what their problem is in a way that they would agree with?
Well, there's a piece there, and there's a group that call themselves the Fifth Principle Project, which is about democratic processes.
Okay. And
I've read some of their statements and the letter of resignation from a number of the UU ministers who resigned. My summary, as I shared in the sermon, was they felt like it was being sort of top-down Boston-centric, that Boston had established these curricula and these views, and their perspective was get on board or else.
Okay.
I've viewed it as an invitation to open your heart and to open your mind and your eyes to see if you might see the world from a very different lens than the lenses I've been looking through my whole life. And so I spent a lot of time listening to colleagues of color, to colleagues with disabilities, colleagues that are not gender binary conforming, and trying to understand their perspective, which I acknowledge is hard to do. I just listen to their reports and try to understand. But these colleagues who I labeled would be surprised to be conservatives seemed to feel they were being told what to do And they pushed back pretty strongly against that. And I didn't read it that way. And I've intended to, though I haven't followed through some conversations with a colleague or two I'm closest to, because I kind of have this sense, well, they've chosen a different path.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard when you've been sort of the center of situations and center of conversations to be asked to mostly listen and perhaps move yourself out of the center. I found that very difficult.
But do you think they would see it that way? That it was the difficulty of not being the center of attention?
Well, somewhat, or they felt like they were being directed as to what they should do. I mean, so, but I can't really speak for them. I mean, I've read their letters and I've interpreted through my lens. And I have a very different sense of it. I mean, I shared with you folks early on a sermon reflecting on when I went to GA and I looked it up there on the stage in front of the GA and I didn't see a single heterosexual identified biological cisgendered male up there. And I kind of went, oh, this is uncomfortable. My identity isn't reflected there.
And I
Is
wanted,
that what it's felt like for others?
but I wanted to ask you about that after I heard that sermon because, for all of us, we would think that would be a beautiful thing showing how inclusive Unitarian Universalism was, right? And I don't know if it's a generational thing. It could, because I am a little younger than you. I've worked for people of color. I've worked for women. I have no problem with women or people of color in leadership roles. It's never made me uncomfortable. But you've talked about being uncomfortable, and I guess I'm just confused about why that is.
Well, it was very different because, I mean, a couple of times, I've been on that stage at GA. One when I was granted fellowship and one in final fellowship in formal ritualized ways, and one as a spokesperson for UU Global AIDS Coalition. And, it just felt different when I looked at a crowd that didn't look like me. And in most UU circles, most of the people I encounter look like me.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Martha. And well, by the way, real quick, thank you, Dennis. I've had these things like rattling around in my head all weekend, and so I really wanted to engage with you on that. So I really appreciate you digging deep on that. Sorry, Martha, go ahead.
Just in my experience of visiting other UU churches when we travel, I find the East Coast UU churches so different than the Midwest or the Western, most of the Western region, where the UU churches, many of which were former congregational churches, et cetera, et cetera. The emphasis on Christianity is quite great. The ritualistic format of them are much more, I don't want to say rigid, but it's set. And what I think, this is just my opinion as a woman, we have made lots and lots of progress over the years, but it's time for all others to also make progress. But it's been historically, the Boston group has been white men. And over time, and that's what I noticed. And I noticed really just in the way they did their churches. Now, I wasn't in many, but for example, I was in the church in Washington, D.C., where the Unitarians and the Universalists joined in 1961. All the clergy were wearing collars, and I didn't find approachable, and I was a guest. I was a visitor, and you would think that people would want to welcome people that are from someplace else. But I mean, maybe it was just us, I don't know. But I just found it really rigid and very staid. So I don't know if that has anything to do with it, because, and I'm thinking of the young man from what's his name? Dr. Rideout, is that his? Yeah.
Yeah.
Who said, in order for us to really get into worship that really gets to the heart of how people feel, take it from some of the Black churches and some of the music, and have much more music that promotes this deep down reaction. And I think that's what I'm trying to me, religion is something that comes from in here, not there. And that's what I noticed on the East Coast. And maybe that's a false equivalency, as my sample was very small. So that's my,
Yeah.
I don't know whether that has any bearing on anything, but that was my experience.
I think that's a valid analysis too. People often talk about the difference between, Northeast traditional Unitarianism and Universalism, and particularly those of us out here on the left coast. And some of that's, I went to the seminary that's more heady and more East Coast, the one in Chicago. I didn't go to Harvard Divinity School, which is the headiest of them all in Boston. I don't know if I would have got in, but I was too intimidated to even try. But Meadville Lombard it's Meadville Lombard Theological School. Okay, I mean, the name is Theological School. I almost considered not going because that name was pretty scary. Theological, right? But meanwhile, here on the West Coast, the largest seminary is Star King School for the Ministry.
Yeah.
School for the Ministry. And Star King is very much more look at what I call, rather than separating as political, I call it engaged faith. How do we put our faith into action? I shared the mission statement of the Eugene Church, which talks about through love, transforming ourselves and serving the world. Star King puts more emphasis on how does that serving the world part become reality.
Yeah, I think also there is a difference in how churches engage, of all faiths, how churches engage with the public if they are a historic and well-attended church. I don't think there's the same need to be as welcoming to the outsiders because we're it. We've got a huge congregation. Our budget's fine. We don't need new members, and I wonder if those historic churches, if they run the risk of falling into that mentality.
Well, if they have a large endowment, they don't need your money.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I mean, the reality of overall numbers in Unitarian Universalism, the numbers are declining in the Northeast.
Right.
And they're going up a little bit in the West. And the end result nationwide is kind of flatline.
I heard that the more rural or small town churches are the largest growth. Is that true?
As I understand it, there's more growth in those kinds of settings than in urban settings.
Right.
But even in the larger picture, data just came out in the last week or so for the first time, in history since we've been counting, less than 50% of Americans belong to anything they would call a church or a temple or an organized religious group.
Right.
And so that's changing in the larger world as well. And sometimes we UUs get people who are not quite ready to quit church, but they quit that church.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. Lurley had something to say.
I'm a bit confused. Martha's talking about her experience in Washington, D.C. church, and you were explaining
in New York.
And Dennis was explaining, okay, if the Unitarian Church back in the 80s was all white male leading the church, what happened to our first principle?
Right. Well, and historically, it has been that Robert Fulgham, who's one of our most famous 20th century Unitarian Universalists. He wrote Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten, and
Yeah.
a bunch of other stuff that went popular. And Fulgham did a description once. He did he called it an imaginary PowerPoint of his graduation from Star King School for the Ministry. And he said it was 8 putty colored men. He didn't call them white. He said we're putty colored. And that's changed. I mean, 2/3 of the clergy in the movement are female. Okay. And it wasn't until 2017 that we elected the first woman president of our association. I mean, we're surprised that the United States wasn't ready to do it in 2016 when good progressive UUs, it took us till 17
Yeah.
to
That's
elect
right.
a woman, you know?
Well,
So,
I mean, that's kind of a dramatic oversimplification of the election.
well, yeah, it is.
Okay. Sharon had her hand up.
First of all, I had a hard time with the sermon and I wanted to listen to it again, but I ran out of time. So Michael, my most pressing question was the one you posted. And I just really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you.
And I appreciate Dennis's response because I really was lost and now I understand better. And to comment on Martha's comparison between the East and the West Coast, my theological roots, so to speak, is from Pennsylvania. And there my parents were Lutheran and Reformed. And I was a zealot for a large part of my childhood. Once I got to college and I could explore different churches, I realized there was a marked difference. But there was an unsettled part of myself that I didn't totally understand until I got here. And I realized it was the lack of spiritual depth that Martha was talking about. And that's what attracted me to Unitarian Universalism. And because of my background, I had a really hard time with the absence of the high church and the clerical collars and the robes and the, I'm forgotten what they're called now.
Stoles.
Yes, the stoles. Because as a choir member, I always wore a stole. So I really appreciate what this discussion is talking about. And thank you very much.
Yeah. And well, thank you for saying that too. Okay.
There's a thing that I will insert here too, that, you know, 2 key elements of who we are as an association, as Unitarian Universalists, is one, we are, as I said, a living tradition, a changing tradition. We're not committed to a creed that never changes. We don't recite the Nicene Creed, you know, that was crafted in, you know, 325 or whatever at the Council of Nicaea. We change and we evolve. I mean, there's an 8th principle in discussion, and there was a talk about rewriting the, you know, the whole set of principles a few years back. So we are open to change and transformation as an entity, and we are an association of independent congregations. And so how that plays out and how that's manifest is different in 1,000 different congregations all across the continent. They're very different. You know, I very early on realized with you folks, my usual wearing a tie and occasionally wearing a stole was not going to make most of you most comfortable. But on occasion, you know, I'll wear a stole. I have some very lovely ones,
Mhm.
you know. So you know, it's, and usually the only time I wear a collar is if I'm going to a political march.
Uh,
And I want to make sure people know the religious left is here too.
that's awesome. But no, you know, you raise a very good point, Dennis, and that is in Unitarian Universalism, the power is derived from the congregation. It's not
That's right.
derived, yeah, from like a top down, like a Vatican kind of
Right.
scenario, and that is something that I deeply appreciate about the religion as well. Um,
I
so
think that's why you see such diversity, because I go to the
yeah.
when I see my brother and family, I always go we go to the church near them. And that's sort of halfway between, you know, so um, the church in Southern California where I went, the ministers wore robes and stoles.
Yeah.
And we as choir members all dressed in black and had beautiful stoles from Guatemala. So, I mean, you know, we did have some decorum, but we were still very let it all hang out kind of place. You
And
know.
Dennis,
So,
for the record, I am very pro stole. So
yeah,
anytime
yes,
you want to
yes,
don
I
that
like it.
robe and stole, I'm behind you in that.
Cool. They're just back there in the back of my closet. I've got 4 or 5 of them.
Well, bring them out.
Let's do Carol and then Kim.
Well, I just wanted to say that as a child, I was required to attend the First Baptist Church, Southern First Baptist Church,
Okay.
and one of the things that I later appreciated when I became an Episcopalian was the tradition of
Yep.
of the robes, the stole. And when I go to the Unitarian Church, which I love the freedom of the Unitarian Church, but I also like it when whoever is speaking wears the stole or whatever. It's comforting to me. It's just a part of a tradition that is comforting, and it also reaffirms that I'm in a special place. I hope I'm expressing
Yes.
myself, because in the First Baptist Church, you know, it was extremely casual as far as dress, Southern Baptist. In the Episcopal Church was just the opposite. And so the Unitarian Church, again, is offering me something that it's offering me a faith that I accept, and it's offering me a little touch of tradition whenever the speaker does wear the robe. And I like it. I like it both.
Me too.
Both
Well,
ways.
you know, and it's a significant symbol for me because I was not authorized to wear a stole until I was ordained.
Ah,
And the
so
first
there.
time I wore a stole was at my ordination, and my ordination stole is made of fabrics picked out by my now late sister-in-law and crafted by my wife. You know, the day they put that on my shoulders, and then, you know, 150 plus people gathered around and laid their hands upon me was profound. And I honor that ritual part of who we are. In fact, I have to wait to get back from a friend in Portland, one of my stoles and my robe, because the last time I wore it was March 9th last year. After I spent the morning with you folks,
Oh,
I
yeah.
got in the car and I drove to Portland to participate in the installation of a colleague as the minister at the West Hills UU Fellowship in Portland. And I forgot my robe. And a friend of mine who's part of that congregation took it home and hung it in his closet. And then COVID happened, right? So my robe is in COVID lockdown in Portland. But I have other stoles so they can show up whether or not Spencer comes for a visit. So.
And when Dennis was recording, we had a brief but nice conversation about ritual and that there is power in ritual. Um,
Well, the
and
shirt you had on looked like a stole.
Yeah.
It had that
oh,
yoke.
that's true.
I don't know whether you
No,
did.
you're right.
No,
I
it's
don't know whether you remembered that or not.
no,
It did.
yeah, I'm intentional about what I wear. When I would wear a shirt and tie, I would pick a tie that had
That meant.
some connection from me
Yeah.
to the sermon, whether or not anybody else knew it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Connie notices your ties.
Yeah.
She's mentioned that several times.
Carol, I see you, and Glennis. But let's move to our resident dissenter, and Kim. I am asking you to unmute, and then let's do Glennis, and then we'll circle back to Carol.
Well, I'm not really a Unitarian, but so I had to look up a lot of stuff because I didn't know what I was talking about. But I'm wondering why Unitarians like to be so political and so political in their sermons.
Well, and I can only speak as this one Unitarian Universalist, and it is part of our tradition as well. In the sense is that, let me think this through. I'm going to go back to that mission statement of the Eugene Church, which ends with "Change the world."
Mhm.
I have a collegial friend who came up with the summary of what he thinks all liberal faiths have in common, whether that's Unitarian Universalism, which is, I consider, a multi-faith tradition, liberal Christianity, liberal Judaism, liberal Buddhism, and that's faith in our ability to make a difference. We don't say it's all in the hands of an outside entity, but we may take an approach that it's our hands that make a better world possible. To use the language of the Reverend Dr. King, we create the beloved community here on earth by what we do. And some of that doing becomes very political. And so, I mean, for example, I haven't decided for sure, but I may go to a rally this afternoon at the federal courthouse in support of Asian Americans in my community who have raised concerns about hateful actions and violence towards Asian Americans. And I may show up and I may wear a stole to stand in solidarity with those people as an act of love. I have a t-shirt, that says "Love the hell out of this world." that I bought from the UU Christian Fellowship at a GA one year. So, that's part of my understanding of theologically why activism and justice work becomes, for me, an important part of my faith made real on the world.
Yeah. And I would love, actually, I think there's probably a lot more to talk about when we're talking about politics and the church or activism. And if we have time for that, maybe we can do that. But let's go to Glennis, and then we'll come back to Carol after that.
Well, for one thing, the social activism and the social awareness within the church is what kept me in the church. I mean, I was introduced to it by a different means, but as soon as I started hearing and exploring just how the 7 principles might apply, or how we might want to change the world for the better, that's actually what keeps me in this church. Secondly, just a comment about the stole. I have seen some absolutely drop dead gorgeous stoles on some of the UA ministers at the GAs. And I liken it to a doctor's lab coat. It's something that kind of gives you the context of what's going on.
I like that description of lab coat, because one of the versions of what a stole symbolizes comes back to the washing of feet as an act of humility. And as Jesus had a towel around his shoulders when he washed the feet of his disciples. And it's, you know, so some part of it isn't about being drop dead gorgeous. It originally, in one version, may have just been a towel.
Although you are, Dennis.
But she became a ritual towel.
Yes, I when I advertise your sermons, I always put in the byline the drop dead gorgeous. So. Carol.
Well, I came in late, so forgive me if you've already touched on this, but in the sermon, I was very impressed by the reference to Ralph Waldo Emerson, and when you quoted him, and I thought, my Lord, what a progressive, I mean, 1836, I believe, something like that.
Yeah.
And it just blew me away that in 1836, a Unitarian, and I don't even know if Unitarians call yourselves pastors or not, but a Unitarian thinker was as progressive as he apparently was. And then I compared it to today, and I feel that so many of the churches that I once considered progressive are reverting. And I'm thinking in particular of the Episcopalian Church in Fort Worth, and how in a recent legal ruling, this one group of, I think, 14 churches, and whoever is the leader, bishop or whatever, they have been considered legally now the controlling church in Fort Worth, and the church that my son belongs to is not part of that group of 14 churches. But legally, his church now is owned by the other group. Literally owned. The property that they built, everything is now owned by the other group. The other group does not believe in women as clergy. They do not accept gay marriages. And so that just blows me away, that we've seen the trend back in 1836 of the Unitarians, and yet today we see a very conservative trend re-emerging. And once upon a time, in the olden days, I thought the Episcopalians were very progressive, even though they were traditional.
It depends on where the Episcopal Church is, though. Our church in California was extremely liberal and was part of our liberal coalition.
Yeah, some Episcopal congregations have been described as Unitarians with better clothes.
Yeah. Well, and
really?
Yeah, I think it also has something to do with the leadership too. Like, if you if you look at like our local Methodist church here, pretty much every bit as liberal as this group is, you know, but you wouldn't find that necessarily maybe in the Midwest or, you know, center of the country. Okay. Well, not seeing any hands up. Okay.
I'll offer a quick piece that may expand on this a little bit, in the sense that I remember a sermon that my most important mentor minister, the Reverend Carolyn Colbert, gave in Eugene. It was titled "Proud to be Leading the Parade." And it was particularly about the history of the churches in the Bay Area engagement in lesbian and gay rights. UU congregations were ordaining, gay and lesbian clergy well before anybody else was. We were the first to ordain women back at Olympia Snow back in the old days. And, so we've often been kind of out there. And then we've had voices within the movement who are even further out there, like Ralph Waldo Emerson was. Many in the church didn't appreciate what he had to say, other than the younger crowd and the more progressive up and coming new ministers. And some of that echoes for me what's happening now, in the sense of the most outspoken people are saying, hold on, slow down, in terms of progressions around full inclusion, are some of the longer term ministers. And I kind of go, I wonder what's that all about.
Right.
And how similar is that
And so
to then and now?
my question to that would be, it's kind of like seeing a sick person, right? We're looking at a sick person and we say, gosh, we know that individual's not healthy. And you take that person to a doctor and one doctor says it's clearly cancer. But maybe it's not cancer. Maybe it's a viral infection, right? Because the treatments could be very, very different. This is the situation that I see with dogmatic politics, right? Like, we can look at the country and say there's division, there is some degree of racism. I think we might disagree on how much racism there is. But to me, there's a segment of the church saying that it is only critical theory or critical race theory or critical sex theory that is going to be the answer to the problems that our nation faces. Whereas there might be better and other explanations, but it's becoming rigid and dogmatic in a lot of people's views.
Right. And I think that would be a shared view with my colleagues who chose to resign from the UUMA, that they felt like it was becoming almost a creed that they were expected to follow. I don't see it that way. I've used the phrase a lot, and and maybe I can figure out a way to articulate it more. I felt that I was called out, and I've also been called in. And I still remember going to that 2017 GA, which is when I was given final fellowship, which final fellowship is the ministerial equivalent of tenure. I'd gone through my probationary period with advisors and reports that I had to submit, and my board had to submit a report, and my committee on ministry had to submit a report to Boston. And I'm was called into final fellowship. So much of what was going on in that GA, I was trying to figure out, what is this white supremacy stuff and where do I fit? But we came together, and one of the co-presidents, Reverend Dr. Cecilia Bedencourt, at the time, I just met her, and then I ended up helping her button her stole to get the neck button, because I was a colleague and she had just met me, and so we could be that close. And we had just this very brief exchange, but we were both UU ministers, and the divisions and the disagreements and stuff were far less important than that we had chosen to covenant together as community and to work through whatever stuff may surface together. And I see that true within congregations as well as within the larger movement. And it saddens me that some of my colleagues felt like they couldn't get any further with the conversation, and they chose to step back a bit. And it deeply saddens me. And if that's what's necessary for things to continue to evolve and figure out who we might be. I mean, some of the things in our past of who we evolved, the Universalist Church of America used to be one of the larger denominations in America because they didn't buy into hellfire and damnation. That's what universalism means, is all will be saved. A loving God would condemn no one to eternal damnation.
Mhm.
That's the core of historic universalism. And many of the mainline Protestant churches became more universalist in their theology, and the Universalist Church lost members. When I went to Whidbey Island, there was a woman who had been attending the congregation, an out lesbian, who attended the Unitarian Church because she didn't feel she was welcome at the Lutheran Church down the road.
Mhm.
And when the Evangelical Church, Lutheran Church of America, which is progressive Lutheranism, voted to affirm same-sex marriage and gay and lesbian clergy,
Mhm.
she went back to the Lutheran Church. And one of the first times she went there was for a same-sex wedding for a couple that I knew. And she didn't need the Unitarian Universalist to be her sanctuary. She could go home because home welcomed her back. And so sometimes I'm not too worried about the total numbers of Unitarian Universalists. If people find something here that they can find elsewhere later, maybe, great. Maybe we helped move those other churches by our actions. And then they can go home and be who they fully are. So.
Well put. Yeah, I remember it was several years ago that the Pope, the most recent Pope, kind of hinted over a tweet at the idea of universal reconciliation, right? The idea that all are forgiven, and the controversy that caused in the Catholic faith. It was really something.
Yeah.
You know.
Oh yeah. Well, one of his name will come to me in a minute, but one of our historic Dietrich, I'm forgetting his first name, but one of our early well-known Universalist ministers who converted from being a Southern Baptist to Universalism, or to Unitarianism at the time. He said, my mother would have rather I had died than become a Unitarian, because if I was a Unitarian, if I had died, I would be in heaven forever. But because I had become a Unitarian, I was condemned to hell.
Right.
So there was some of that feeling there that we were heretics. And sometimes there still is.
Yeah. Okay. We'll just let you all ponder that for a second. Wow. Now we got more crickets. Oh, yeah, go for it, Martha. Thank you.
Well, I'm just saying, I look at, or at least what we try to do is welcoming all. And we do have some people in our congregation that are more zealous than others. And that's just a normal kind of blend of people's activism, belief, whatever you want to call it. But I think for us as a little church of not that many, I mean, we're a very, very tiny congregation. We have held our own we're sort of an oasis in the middle of many, many people who are religious churchgoers and our family churchgoers in many generations, and all in very, very traditional types of things. And we also have a lot of small independent churches that have blown up here and there, that are run not by people that have gone to any organized seminary or anything. So we're a little beacon there for people who might not feel comfortable, and we've had those people come and have joined us.
Yeah.
And I think that's our strength, as a small place.
The thing that plagues me is that poor young man. There was a young man who showed up in a Trump hat. And,
okay.
Yeah, and
I wasn't there that day, but I heard you speak of it. Yeah.
The way that he was treated, and he came with his family, and we never saw that family again.
Was that by one person?
No, it was more than a few. And and
It's
it
too
just
bad.
breaks, yeah, it breaks my heart, because we do have to have conversations about if we're welcoming to people
Mm-hmm.
with differing
Mm-hmm.
political opinions.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That is a challenge, you know, and a kind of continuing challenge, because, you know, if we do have shared values and we feel like some political opinions are contrary to those values, it's hard to find common ground sometimes.
But we also have to realize that we keep our politics to the park, out the parking lot, supposedly not inside the building. And that's one thing that needs to be more general. I mean, as far as you can have your ideas and you can converse, but to openly, you know, criticize or like this, if this young, I mean, I wasn't there, but if that family was made to feel uncomfortable, that's not what a Unitarian Universalist should be doing.
Right.
No.
We have our highest aspirations and we have what we actually do sometimes.
Yeah, no, that's
that, that is a great point. That's a great point. That was something that and by the way, Dennis, the title and the concept of your sermon was something I wholeheartedly agree with, because my interpretation of the first and the second commandments regards our highest aspiration. You know, that God can be replaced with what we worship as the target that we're trying to get to. So I appreciate that. And Kim.
Well, you were talking about how you're accepting of people who have other political beliefs. Sometimes you're not. If you're all left and you all have your opinions, and when someone comes in with a different opinion, you tend to disagree with them, as opposed to listen to them and just disagree with. I don't have a problem if a person's disagreeing with me, but I have a problem with them disagreeing with me and not listening to what I'm saying. And that you almost seem like you're trying to change my mind, kind of. I get the feeling that you're trying to change my mind, like, well, we need to talk so that so that you guys can change my mind. Well, my mind's not going to change. I just have a different opinion on various things. And I think that's what happens when new people come in. You don't know what their opinion is. You just know that they're wearing a Trump hat. And so you assume all these things and you don't get to know the person. People who are Trump supporters are just as great people as people who are on the other side. And because obviously I'm friends with all of you guys, and yet I'm a Trump supporter. So, and I have friends who are Trump supporters too, both. And I like everybody. Now in my church, we don't have one way or the other. And I don't know if my church is half Democrat and half Republican, but somewhere in that neighborhood. But we don't ever talk about it when we're in church. Let's talk about it later on. But when we're in church, we're talking about whatever's about church, and we never get political mixed up with that.
Okay.
I think. Okay.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to give Dennis a chance to respond if he wanted to.
Okay.
Right. Well, I think it's, the question of partisan politics, I certainly agree, but the reality of values, if we believe in an inherent web of all existence of which we are a part, then we are more likely to believe that humans have had an impact on the climate. And that comes from our values. If we look at even what Emerson wrote in the 1830s about nature and our interrelationship with all life, that shapes things that become political, but it doesn't need to be about partisan politics. It's about the underlying foundational values that we make manifest in the world.
So we would need like 3 more hours to tackle this topic. Oh, yeah. And we're running short on time. Carol, I think you get the last word.
Okay, thank you. I'm directing this question to Dennis. I have a very good friend, very intelligent, very open-minded friend, and the church she was going to had to close because of lack of membership. It was a Methodist church, and I said, "Why don't you?" She was talking to me about her feeling of loss because of not being able to attend her church. I said, "Why don't you give our church," I said, "a try, the Unitarian Church?" Now, this question for Dennis is, Dennis, how would you have answered her when she asked, "But does your church believe in Jesus? Is your church a Christian church?" So, and then how would you answer that, Dennis?
Well, I would ask of, well, there's two things. I'm going to do a two-part in terms of what do you mean by believe in Jesus? Do you mean following the teachers of the Rabbi Jesus, who was, we can all agree, a profound teacher? Or do you believe in the Nicene Creed, which talks about the divinity of Jesus who became the Christ? That's part of it. I mean, I sometimes use the description, I'm a Christian, but I'm not fully a Christian. I'm what I call a gospel Christian, but I'm not necessarily a Pauline Christian. I have far more faith in the Gospels than I do in the epistles of Paul. Paul was a person who never met Jesus. So I'm more skeptical about the epistles of Paul. And that comes from my own biblical study and my own pondering and my own escape from the Nazarene church of my childhood. That's why I'm more a universalist than I am a Unitarian. Unitarian is the adjective. And then I would follow it up more broadly with definition of divinity. There's a story about Forest Church, who for many years was the minister in what for a long time was our largest church in downtown Manhattan in New York. And All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church. And Forrest supposedly was approaching, he was on an airplane, and you have those conversations with the person sitting next to you. And he found out he was a clergy person. He says, "I need to ask you, Reverend, as one of those ministers, do you believe in God?" And Church's answer was, "Tell me about your God, and then we can talk about whether or not I believe in that definition of God."
Right.
And that's something I lift up in a previous sermon from the quote from Micah, "Walk humbly with your God." And to me, one of the most powerful parts of our faith tradition is your God as defined by you, not my God that I expect you to believe in the same way I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well
Thank
put.
you.
Yeah, very well put.
Thank you,
Matt,
Dana. Perfect.
you know, I think what is it, a Bible verse that says iron sharpens iron? You know?
I have to admit, I would have to Google it.
Yeah, I'd have to Google it too.
When I was a
But
hospital chaplain, I would show up at bedsides and people would say, "Can you read for me the piece from, whatever about blah, blah, blah." And I went, "Well, this particular chaplain's going to have to look it up."
but I hope everybody else feels as deeply satisfied with this conversation as I do. Dennis, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to have you. And for everyone else, we will see you next week. Take
Oh,
care.
I got it.
See you a few weeks down the road.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.